How did people survive in the Middle Ages, when winter was not just a season, but a ruthless, hungry predator that slowly and inevitably took the weak? We imagine their existence as an endless, gray struggle with cold and hunger in wind-blown shacks, where death was as common a guest as the frost on the walls. This story takes you into the chilling, deafeningly quiet world of a medieval English village, where survival was not suffering but a high-honed art, and intimate knowledge of nature was the chief treasure passed down from generation to generation. This is the story of how people, driven to the very edge of the abyss, made small but ingenious discoveries that allowed them to cheat death and live to see the first spring thaw. Are you ready to learn that survival in the past was both scarier and more beautiful than we can imagine? Then let's begin. When by midwinter in the so-called hungry months of January and February, the last grains in the clay pot were counted and the dried vegetables, shriveled and hard as stone, came to an end, a real, unconcealed, silent hunger began for the peasant family. And then, like their ancestors for millennia, they turned to their last, most reliable, but also most dangerous source of food, the winter forest. But they were not looking for berries or mushrooms, which were long gone under the snow. They resorted to real, desperate forest alchemy, turning what we today consider inedible or even poisonous into a life-saving food that could sustain the smoldering fire of life until the first spring grass. The main such resource was acorns. Mighty oak forests covered much of medieval England, and in harvest years, the ground beneath the oaks was literally littered with brown, shiny acorns. However, raw acorns are inedible and toxic to humans due to their high tannin content, the same tannins used for leather. The tannins give them an unbearably bitter, astringent flavor that makes you cringe and, in large quantities, can cause serious kidney and liver damage. To make them edible, peasants have passed down a complex, laborious, and painful leaching process from generation to generation. In the fall, anticipating the coming hungry months, women and children raked acorns into sacks, dried them on warm stones by the hearth, and then spent long evenings grinding them into coarse flour with a simple hand millstone, two heavy stones whose rotation required great strength. Then began the longest and most responsible stage, washing. It was a real test of patience. A rough cloth bag filled with acorn flour was simply lowered into an icy running stream for several days or even a week, securely tied to a rock or snag. The icy, crystal-clear water slowly but surely washed away the bitter, water-soluble tannins. Another faster, but also more costly method was to boil the flour in several changes of water over the hearth. The flour was poured in water, brought to a boil, and then drained of the dark, almost black, bitter, and poisonous broth. The procedure was repeated over and over again until the water was almost pure. This method required a huge amount of precious firewood, which was an unaffordable luxury for most people. After this treatment, the bitter flour became fresh and edible. It was pressed, dried by the hearth, and turned into a dense, dark mass. It was mixed with the rest of the real flour, if there was any, or used pure to bake flat, heavy black cakes directly on the hot stones of the hearth. They tasted awful, tasteless, earthy, dense as stone, and tough. But they were caloric and nutritious, rich in carbohydrates, fat, and protein. These acorn loaves were often the only food standing between a family and starvation. But if there were no acorns or the year was bad, the bark of trees was used. The peasants knew that it was not the rough outer crust itself that was edible, but the thin, living, juicy inner layer between the bark and the wood, the cambium. It is through this layer that the sweet juices of the tree flow in spring with the first warmth. It was carefully scraped off pine, birch, or elm trees with a knife, taking care not to damage the tree itself all around so that it would not die. This layer, which looked like wet sawdust, was dried on stones and then ground into flour. This flour was added in small quantities to the meager supplies of rye or barley to stretch them. Bread laced with such flour was bitter, fibrous with a strong tarry flavor, and caused serious digestive problems, but it filled an empty, cramped stomach. In the most desperate times, people ate dried and crushed tree buds, Roots of wild plants like burdock or chicory dug from under the snow, and even some mosses and lichens that had been boiled for a long time to get rid of bitterness. This was not cooking, but the chemistry of survival, the secret, sacred knowledge of how to neutralize poisons and extract calories from the heart of the dead winter forest. Winter was a time of high, almost inevitable mortality. Old people whose bodies could no longer fight the cold, infants too fragile for the harsh world, and people weakened by disease or malnutrition often did not survive until spring. And the death of a loved one in winter turned not only into a deep grief, but also into a terrible, unsolvable domestic problem. The ground froze to a depth of a meter or more, turning to stone. Digging a grave in the church cemetery with primitive tools, a wooden shovel with an iron tip and a heavy pickaxe, was virtually impossible. It would have required days of grueling labor in the freezing cold, for which the people, weakened by hunger, simply did not have the strength. What was done with the dead? They could not be buried, so the peasants had to resort to the gruesome, chilling practice of temporarily storing the bodies until the spring thaw. This was their own road of the dead, the way the deceased had to travel from the deathbed to the consecrated ground, and this way could stretch for long, agonizing months. The body of the deceased, according to Christian custom, was washed with cold water, dressed in the best clothes he had, often the same clothes he had been married in, and wrapped tightly in a shroud. The shroud was not just a piece of cloth, it was an important part of the burial ritual, designed to keep the body intact and to separate the world of the dead from the world of the living. Then began the most difficult and terrible choice: where to store it. There were few options, and all of them were horrible. If the family had a separate barn for livestock or a cold cellar, the body could be placed there, away from the living space, covered with hay or old sacks. But more often than not, the only structure the family owned was the one-room hut itself. Sometimes the body was taken outside and left in a hut made of branches and snow, or just in a deep snowdrift, so that wild animals, wolves or foxes, could not get to it. But the most terrible and, alas, widespread variant, the body remained inside the hut. It could be placed in the coldest corner, against the wall farthest from the hearth, and separated from the rest of the space by a screen of burlap or old skins. Sometimes he was taken up to the attic, under the thatched roof, where the frosty air was constantly walking and the temperature was consistently low. Imagine this psychological torture. A family of 5 or 6 lives eats, sleeps, and works in one tiny, dark, smoke-soaked room, while a few feet away, behind a thin, symbolic partition, lies the frozen, stiffened, frost-covered body of their father, mother, or child. Every day they see this silent bundle, feel its chilling presence, smell the sweet odor of decay if there was a thaw. It was a constant, silent reminder of the fragility of life and of their own predicament. The children grew up in a world where death was not an abstract concept from the priest's sermons, but a physical neighbor with whom they shared their home. It fostered in them fatalism and a stoic acceptance of death, but at what cost to their childish psyche? With the arrival of the first real thaw, when the ground was soft enough to dig, the whole village would gather to commit to the ground those who had died over the winter. It was a somber ritual, a collective funeral that drew a line under the darkest months of the year. A cart drove through the village, collecting bodies from huts and barns. It was a silent, mournful procession that moved toward the church cemetery to finally give peace to the souls of the dead and relief to the souls of the living. This ghastly custom was not an act of cruelty or indifference, but a harsh, inevitable necessity, another terrible compromise that had to be made in order to honor Christian burial rites and preserve one's own sanity. When hunger became unbearable, when acorn bread ran out and the first spring nettles were weeks away, the peasant could resort to the most desperate, almost pagan way to get food without losing his main asset and hope for the future: his livestock. He began to drink red water, the blood of his animals. To kill a cow or a bull in winter was tantamount to signing a death warrant for the whole family for the next year. The cow gave precious milk, which kept the children alive. A bull was needed for spring plowing, without which there would be no new harvest. To lose an animal was to condemn the family to imminent starvation the following year. So peasants, especially in the pastoral regions of northern England and Scandinavia, practiced what modern veterinarians would call controlled therapeutic bloodletting. Only the goal was not the therapy of the animal, but human survival. The man, the head of the family, would take a special sharp knife with a short blade or an instrument similar to a lancet and approach the calmest and strongest animal in the herd. He would calm the cow or bull, stroke it, and then with a sharp, precise movement, make a small but deep incision on the jugular vein in its neck. Thick, dark blood, almost black in the frost, began to gush from the wound, which was immediately collected in a clay pot or wooden bowl. It was important to decant not too much, usually not more than a liter, so as not to weaken or kill the animal. Then the wound was quickly plugged with a bundle of clean moss or cauterized with a red-hot iron to stop the bleeding. The animal staggered away and the family received their terrible supper. The blood collected was an invaluable food resource. It was incredibly rich in digestible protein, iron necessary for hematopoiesis, and salts that the body lost with sweat even in the cold. It was not, of course, drunk raw. Most often the blood was immediately poured into a cauldron, added a little water, a handful of oatmeal or barley flour for thickness, wild onions or garlic if there were any, and cooked on the hearth for a long time, stirring constantly until it curdled and turned into a thick, black, lumpy chowder, similar to blood sausage without the casing. This dish was unappetizing to look at and had a strong metallic flavor, but it was hot, incredibly filling, and gave the body the animal protein it had been deprived of for months. This practice made it possible to survive the hungriest weeks without sacrificing the future herd. It was an act of cold, calculated survival where sentiment and squeamishness receded in the face of starvation. Imagine a peasant who may have delivered this cow himself, who nursed her every day, and now has to cut her vein to feed his starving, crying children who look at him with hope and horror. It's another eerie but integral touch to the portrait of a medieval winter, where the line between life and death, care and cruelty, was incredibly, unthinkably thin. Heat was the main currency of winter. Every chip, every piece of peat, every coal was strictly accounted for. It was an unthinkable luxury to heat the hearth all night long, keeping it burning brightly, for which most families simply did not have enough firewood to spare. The hearth was lit in the evening for cooking, and the coals were covered with ash overnight to keep them smoldering until morning. By the middle of the night, the hut was getting cold, and the temperature inside was almost comparable to that outside, dropping to 0 or even lower. A family sleeping on straw bedding on a cold earthen floor risked freezing to death in their sleep. And then they resorted to the most ancient, reliable, and living source of warmth, their animals. We have already mentioned how peasants sought escape in the castle stables, but the same thing, on an even more intimate and concentrated scale, took place in their own homes. The medieval peasant hut, or cruh house, was often a single long space under one roof, where both people and their most valuable livestock lived. Sometimes there was a low partitioned off far side of the room for the animals, but often they were right there in the same room as the family, separated only by an imaginary line. When the weather got very cold, the most valuable and vulnerable animals, a newborn calf, a few sheep, a milk goat, and sometimes a suckling pig, were brought into the hut overnight. This was done not only to save the cattle themselves from freezing or predators, but also to use them as large, warm, breathable warmers. The family spread their straw mattresses or simply threw a pile of straw close to where the animals lay on their bedding. They went to sleep next to the warm, massive, milk-smelling body of a cow or a sheep huddled in a tight, woolly pile. The heat coming from the animals' bodies kept them warm all night long. It was a living blanket that did not get cold. The steady, calm breathing of the animals moistened and slightly warmed the icy air in the room. It was an absolute, almost primal fusion of the human and animal worlds. Boundaries were blurred. People slept to the lulling sounds of slow gum chewing, sniffing, mooing, or bleating. The air was heavy with the odor of manure, urine, sour milk, and warm, wet wool. Hygiene, from our point of view, was at 0. The risk of animal-to-human disease transmission from skin parasites to brucellosis, was enormous. But the choice was not between comfort and discomfort, but between life and death. Sleeping in mud and warmth was the only way to survive. This custom seems wild to us, but to the medieval peasant, it was part of the natural, God-ordained order of things. Animals were not just property or resources, but members of an extended household, junior, unintelligent partners in survival. This close, odoriferous symbiosis, where men and cattle shared one shelter, one fate, and one warmth, was one of the most terrifying and yet most touching and intimate realities of winter life. Physical deprivation, cold, and hunger was only one visible side of winter survival. The other, no less terrible and exhausting, was the struggle with the darkness that came not only from the outside, but also from within the human soul. A winter day in northern England was frustratingly short, only 7 to 8 hours of dim, gray, bleak light. And then came the long, impenetrable 16-hour night, almost completely black. Artificial light sources were an unacceptable luxury. The fire in the hearth gave a little light, but it was often dimmed or extinguished at night to save wood. Greasy candles or grease pots, smoky and foul-smelling, were lit only briefly for the most necessary work, such as fixing tools or preparing a meager dinner. The family spent most of the time, from 4 o'clock in the afternoon until 8 in the morning, in total or near total darkness, locked in their tiny, cramped, stuffy shack. This killer combination of factors, perpetual darkness, piercing cold, chronic malnutrition, sensory deprivation, and claustrophobia, had a devastating effect on the human psyche. Today, we would call it a severe form of seasonal affective disorder, exacerbated by avidominosis and constant stress. But for medieval man, whose mind was imbued with an archaic belief in spirits, demons, ghosts, and supernatural powers, it was something far worse. The darkness seemed a living, hostile entity, filled with evil spirits that penetrated the soul through the ears and eyes and drove it mad. The long winter night was a time when the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead thinned, and the souls of the undead could return to their homes. People suffered from severe depression, apathy, attacks of inexplicable anxiety and panic. Some fell into a state that neighbors called winter madness. They could sit for hours staring at one point, or, on the contrary, rushing around the hut, screaming and crying for no apparent reason. And the survival life hack here was purely psychological. In order not to go mad, it was necessary to structure this endless, pressurizing darkness. The main weapon was routine and ritual. Every evening, sitting in the dark by smoldering embers, people engaged in monotonous, almost meditative work that occupied the hands and calmed the mind. Men silently mended harnesses, carved spoons, women endlessly spun or picked wool. But even more important was the oral tradition. Old men, the keepers of the family memory, became the main healers of souls. They were the living library, the only entertainment and escape from madness. They told stories. They weren't just bedtime stories. They were epic ballads about Beowulf and other heroes who fought monsters in the darkness. They were hagiographies of saints who endured unimaginable torments but did not give up and found paradise. They were scary, cautionary tales of ghosts and goblins that taught caution and proper behavior. And they were crude, salty, funny household anecdotes that elicited salutary, cleansing laughter. These stories gave meaning to the darkness, structured time, and united the family in a shared emotional experience, singing wistful ballads, praying together, muttering prayers. These were all ways to chase away the inner darkness through sound and a shared rhythm. It was a desperate daily attempt to maintain sanity in a world that seemed to be forever plunged into eternal, cold night. In a world where darkness reigned for 16 hours a day, and daylight was dull, watery, and gray, every ray of sunlight that broke through the low clouds was worth its weight in gold. The medieval peasant, whose life was inextricably linked to the cycles of nature, intuitively understood that light was not only an opportunity to see and work, it was a source of psychological comfort, a symbol of life, and even, he believed, a guarantee of health. So lacking candles and lamps, They developed a whole system of passive technologies to capture, retain, and multiply the precious winter light, transforming their dark, smoky hut into the likeness of a sunstone shining from within. The main and most effective tool in this endeavor was ordinary lime or ground chalk. The walls inside the peasant's hut, woven of twigs and covered with clay and dung, and then constantly fumigated by the smoke from the hearth, were dark, almost black. They greedily absorbed the scanty light that penetrated them. But if these walls were covered with a thick layer of lime whitewash, a real miracle happened. The hut was transformed. The white, uneven, textured surface worked like a perfect diffuser. A dim, directed beam of light falling from a small window or open doorway reflected off the white walls, repeatedly re-reflected, fractured, and filled the whole room with a soft, even almost unearthly glow. This not only allowed for small jobs, such as spinning or mending a net, even away from a direct light source, but also visually expanded the cramped, claustrophobic space, making it less oppressive and more cozy. Lime extraction was a collective labor. In the fall, men from the village could go to the limestone outcrops, break stones, and burn them in a makeshift pit kiln. The process of quenching the lime, when water was added to the burnt stone, was an impressive spectacle, with hissing, steam, and the release of heat. Whitewashing also had the most important hygienic effect. Lime is a strong alkali with powerful antiseptic properties. It killed mold and fungus spores that would inevitably appear on damp walls and repelled insects, lice, and fleas that might nest in clay or wooden walls. Thus, this simple technique made the house not only much brighter, but also much healthier. But the peasants went further in their art of light engineering. They used other tricks to control the light. For example, a mirror-polished pewter or copper basin placed behind a grease lamp worked as a primitive but effective reflector, collecting light and directing it in the right direction, doubling or even tripling the illumination of the workplace. Sometimes a simple clay bowl filled with clean water was used for the same purpose. It worked like a liquid lens, focusing and making the weak flame of the torch brighter and more stable. And the shiny frost on the inside of the window opening, covered with bullseye bubble, became a reflector in itself, catching and scattering the morning light. The location of the hut itself in the village was also often not accidental. It would be built so that the entrance and the main, albeit tiny window, faced south. This simple principle of passive solar heating and lighting allowed to capture the maximum of the low winter sun. On a clear, frosty day, when the snow outside turned into a dazzling reflector, the door open wide would flood the cabin for a few minutes with such a brilliant light that it seemed a veritable divine revelation. These seemingly small things combined to have a huge effect. They were a manifestation not of desperation, but of meaningful, intelligent habitat design. Peasants didn't just put up with darkness. They actively fought against it, using the simplest and most accessible materials to bring a little more light, purity, and beauty into their lives. And sometimes they were able to make life itself sprout in the midst of the dead of winter. One of the main and most insidious dangers of the long English winter was avitaminosis, in particular a total lack of vitamins C and A. This led to scurvy, nightmares, chicken blindness, a sharp deterioration of vision at dusk, and a general decline in immunity. The winter ration, consisting of grain, flour, dried beans, and salted meat, was virtually devoid of fresh produce. But even here, peasant ingenuity, based on centuries-old observations of nature, found an ingenious and unexpected way out. They created their own winter vegetable garden, which required neither sun nor fertile land, but only a little warmth from the hearth, darkness, and pre-prepared roots. This technique is now known in agronomy as burning or forcing. In the fall during the harvest, wise housewives selected not only the best root crops for long-term storage in the cellar, but also those that were worse, as well as the roots of wild plants. The roots of chicory, dandelion, and wild parsnip were especially valued. This act was not just a collection, but a conscious investment in the future winter health of the family. They did not wash the collected roots, but simply peeled them from the ground and stored them in a cold but not freezing cellar, or simply buried them in a hole, pouring dry sand over them to keep them alive but sleeping. In the middle of winter, in January or February, when the need for vitamins became critical, These roots were taken out and awakened to life. They were stacked vertically in an old wooden box or a large clay pot, covered with wet sand or earth, and placed in the warmest and, importantly, darkest place in the hut, usually in a niche near the hearth, but carefully covered from direct light with burlap or burlap. Heat and moisture gave the dormant root a deceptive signal. Spring had arrived, it was time to grow. The root began to sprout, using the nutrients accumulated in its body over the summer. Since the process took place in total darkness, photosynthesis was impossible, and no chlorophyll was produced in the leaves. As a result, the sprouts did not grow green and bitter, but delicate white, pale yellow, or reddish, like chicory. They were incredibly tender, crisp, juicy, and had a pleasant, tangy, slightly bitter flavor. These blanched shoots, today we know them in their ennobled form as salad chicory or whitloaf, were a true delicacy and, most importantly, an invaluable source of live vitamins, fiber, and micronutrients in the middle of winter. A bundle of such fresh, crisp greens eaten by a family was not just food. It was a taste of spring, a taste of life, a crisp reminder that nature is not dead, just sleeping, and will soon awaken. It was a small but very important breakthrough in the fight against winter depression, apathy, and illness. Grains could also be sprouted in a similar way. A small amount of wheat or barley was spread thinly on a damp cloth in a warm place. After a few days, tender green sprouts, rich in enzymes and vitamins, would appear, which were also finely chopped and added to soups or eaten plain. This clever agricultural technique showed a deep understanding of plant life cycles and the ability to subtly manipulate them for their own benefit. It wasn't just food, it was a small man-made miracle, created by human hands in the heart of the dead, cold winter. Perhaps the most important, the most powerful, and the most positive life hacks for winter survival were not clever technology or knowledge of nature's secrets, but a special social organization. With the onset of severe cold weather and deep snowfalls, when working outside became impossible and traveling between villages became dangerous, the community instinctively went into a mode of social hibernation. It turned into a single self-contained superorganism operating according to the main principles: maximum energy conservation, pooling of resources, and support of the spirit. Life did not stop. It simply clenched like a fist before a blow and moved from scattered individual huts into a common, collective space. Often several neighboring families, especially if they were related by kinship or friendship, would gather for long evenings or even for days and nights in one, the most spacious, warm, and sheltered hut. This was done not only to pass the time socializing, but also for purely pragmatic reasons. Instead of stoking 3 or 4 separate, inefficient hearths, wasting precious and strictly limited supplies of firewood, they stoked only one, but a large and strong one. And the heat generated by the bodies of 20 or 30 people in one enclosed room by itself significantly increased the temperature, creating a comfortable microclimate. But the main center and symbol of this social life was the common pot. This was not just cooking, but a real daily ritual, demonstrating the essence of communal survival. Each family brought what little they had to the common fire. One hostess poured into the cauldron a handful of dried peas, another a shriveled onion, and a couple of last cloves of garlic. A third, the luckiest, a piece of salted lard or a brain bone with some meat still on it. A fourth, a bundle of dried herbs gathered in summer. All this was sent into one large cauldron hanging over the common fire. The result was a thick, steaming, flavorful chowder, far more delicious, rich, and nutritious than the wretched ballad that each family could make on their own. In such a common hut, there was a quiet, measured, productive life. The men sat around the fire and repaired tools, mending cracked axe handles, weaving new harnesses from leather straps, carving spoons and bowls from wood. Women would set up their homemade spinning wheels in the brightest corner and spin wool together, making the winter months the main season of yarn production for future clothing. The constant, lulling, whirring hum of the spinning wheels was the true soundtrack of the medieval winter, the sound of patience and creation. It was also the most important time for the transmission of knowledge. Old men, no longer capable of hard physical work, were the main keepers of traditions, living libraries of the community. They told children old legends, fairy tales, legends about saints and local heroes. They taught young people the wisdom of survival, how to predict the weather by the color of the sunset or the behavior of crows, what herbs to gather to cure a cough, how to sharpen a knife or read footprints in the snow. Oral tradition flourished precisely during these long, dark hours of collective, seemingly idle time. This social hibernation was also a powerful psychological mechanism. It kept people from falling into despondency and despair from the cold, darkness, and monotony. Working together, laughing quietly, singing dreary songs, sharing news and gossip all created a salutary sense of unity and support. People felt that they were not alone in their struggle. The community became a big family where widows and orphans were taken care of, and the last piece of bread was shared with those who had run out earlier. This dense social fabric was stronger than any wall and warmer than any fire. It made it possible to survive the winter not as a group of frightened, freezing loners, but as a single, united, and invincible organism. In the endless, monotonous series of gray, cold, and dark days, there were bright, dazzling flashes of light and joy that were as important to survival as a food or warmth. These were the winter holidays. For the medieval peasant, the winter solstice, the ancient pagan festival of Yule, later skillfully merged with the Christian Christmas, and the following 12 holy days were not just dates on the calendar. It was the most important psychological milestone, the main battle of the year against the all-consuming darkness, and they prepared for it in advance, with trepidation and hope. The main symbol and weapon in this battle was the Yule fire. Throughout the year, while working in the forest, the family noticed the biggest, strongest, and driest log, usually from a mighty oak tree, a tree symbolizing strength and longevity. On the eve of the solstice, the men of the village solemnly brought it from the forest. This log was special, sacred. It was decorated with evergreen branches of ivy, holly, and mistletoe, symbols of eternal life, which does not die even in the dead winter forest. Before lighting it, it was poured with the best ale or cider, sprinkled with flour. It was a kind of sacrifice, a tribute to the spirits of the house and the ancient gods of fertility, which still lived in the minds of people under a thin layer of Christianity. Then this huge log was dragged into the hut and placed in the hearth. It was set on fire not just for fun, but from the coal that had been carefully preserved from the previous year's Yule fire. This little smoldering coal, carried through the year, symbolized the continuity of life and the eternal return of light. The Yule log was supposed to burn without dying all 12 days of the holiday until the Epiphany. It gave not just warmth, but a bright, cheerful, lively fire that danced and crackled, dispelling darkness and shadows in the corners, and created a unique atmosphere of festivity, safety, and comfort in the hut. The ashes from this log were considered sacred, possessing healing and protective powers. It was collected, stored all year, and sprinkled on the fields before sowing to ensure the harvest and protect the house from lightning and evil spirits. The holiday was also the time of the long-awaited feast. Even the poorest families tried to save the best they had for this time. They slaughtered the last pig or goose, baked special bread with precious dried fruits and spices, and brewed strong, spicy ale with herbs. It was a time of abundance, albeit short-lived, in the midst of widespread scarcity and hunger. People visited each other, exchanged gifts, mostly food or small crafts, sang songs, dressed up, and organized noisy, rough games. All this had a tremendous psychological significance. The holiday broke the closed circle of monotonous survival. It gave people what they had been deprived of for months: bright light, delicious and varied food, unrestrained laughter, lively communication, and most importantly, hope. The very fact that the day had stopped waning and was beginning to arrive, albeit at a sparrow's skip, was celebrated as the greatest cosmic victory of life over death. This ritual, this collective, universal joy, energized people with emotional energy that helped them survive the remaining coldest and hungriest months of winter, January and February. It was a conscious, wise decision to contrast darkness and despair, not with fear and despondency, but with celebration and laughter. And finally, the most important, the quietest, but also the most powerful positive, and medieval survival life hack of all. It didn't warm the body or fill the stomach, but it nourished that without which all other tricks and stratagems would be utterly meaningless. It nourished hope. It was the sacred tradition of seed storage. Every peasant family, even the poorest, had its own small but priceless treasure. It was stored not in a locked chest, but in modest clay pots, tightly tied leather bags, or willow-woven boxes, in the driest, darkest, and safest place in the hut. Often on a wooden shelf high by the warm hearth, away from mice and moisture, they were seeds. The seeds of rye, barley, peas, cabbage, turnips. They were the concentrated future of the family, the pledge of the next harvest, the model of life itself compressed to a tiny size. On the hungriest days in February, when stomachs were empty, when children cried with hunger and adults felt their strength draining away, the temptation to open these sacks and eat the seeds was enormous. A handful of grain boiled in a liquid chowder could have prolonged existence for another day, but everyone in the family, from the smallest to the largest, knew that this was an absolute taboo. To eat the seeds was to eat one's future. It would be an act of final despair, an admission of your total defeat before winter, a surrender. It meant that even if you survived the day, you would starve to death in the summer because you would have nothing to sow. Seed storage was not just an agricultural technique, but almost a religious, sacred ritual. Periodically, the mistress of the house, the guardian of the hearth and the future, would take out these sacks. She poured out the seeds on a dry board, searched them with her calloused fingers, checking if they were damp, if weevils had got into them, if mold had touched them. This process was an act of faith and meditation. When a man held these small, hard, sleeping lumps of life in his hands, he physically felt the future. He imagined how, with the first warmth, he would go to his field, how he would throw them into the warm, moist, spring-scented earth. He saw how the first tender green sprouts appeared, how they reached for the sun, how the field sprouted under the summer wind. These seeds were the material embodiment of a promise that winter would not last forever, that the sun would surely return, that there would be warmth again, that there would be food, that there would be hard but joyful work in the fields, and that there would be the laughter of children who had had enough to eat. They were a solid, reliable bridge across the dark, icy abyss of winter into the green, full of life and hope spring. Looking into the world of medieval winter, we saw a marvelous picture woven from extremes. On the one hand, the chilling horror of hunger, disease, and death that forced people to eat tree bark and sleep next to the dead. On the other, an astonishing story of light, warmth, and an unyielding will to live, of people who grew gardens in the dark, turned a feast into a weapon, and stored the future in a clay pot. The story of their survival is more than just a collection of life hacks. It is a hymn to human duality, to our species' ability to stoop to the worst compromises while rising to the heights of ingenious ingenuity, cooperation, and hope. Their strength was not in technology, but in their deep harmony with nature and, more importantly, with each other. If you were interested in this journey into the past, put a like and subscribe to our channel to learn even more amazing stories about the brilliant ideas of our ancestors.